Well, it's been 4 weeks since the last time I sat before this camera in my home to provide a video for you. I spent 2 weeks preaching, one in our home church at Somerville Baptist while the pastor was gone, and another in a country church. And those of you who watched that saw the images, two very different worlds. Somerville Baptist, large colonial structure, big crowd, 3 services on Sunday at the main campus, 2 in the morning and 1 in the evening, so it made a long day. And then Cordsville First Baptist Church, which is truly in the country, really on the other side of the world from here. But anyway, good experiences both times. Appreciated the people there. They were very kind and generous with their words. And then the following week, for whatever reason, the challenges were, and the schedule was, that there was just simply not a good opportunity to sit down before the camera and provide you with something. But I've been in a serious journey, and this has become, by my own admission, sort of a video journaling process, because it's all revolving around what God is doing, what I see God is doing, and my sense of purpose and calling in life, primarily to reach out to churches that are struggling as a part of a rebirthing experience. But there's very little of that that's actually going on. The churches that are doing well don't necessarily need the services I have to offer. The churches that are not doing well, most of them are still living with illusions that if they just keep doing what they've always done, which in the past had worked at least to their satisfaction, that eventually things will cycle back around and be, quote, normal for them. And so they're not necessarily interested in what I have to offer. Now, it's remarkable that as I have occasions to have conversation with people, there is something of an interest in the whole business of rebirthing or revitalization. But when it comes down to the context and the environment of the local church, there tends to be sort of a regression from that, a backing off from that, probably out of fear of the unknown, and some of it may be the fear of the known, because they know that it's not going to go backward. But nonetheless, life is going on, and I've continued in my own spiritual journey and what God is doing, the opportunities that He's presenting me with, the relationships and connections that I've been able to make. And so that, with that something as a backdrop, I admit to you that in addition to helping those struggling churches or desire to do that, I continue to try to understand the minds of people that either have never had a faith relationship with God and Jesus Christ, or they have had one by their own admission and by the testimony of their lives, from which they have digressed, and they no longer consider themselves among believers, certainly not Christ's followers. And one of my challenges, and part of my nature, I've admitted to you in the past that, there are really 3 kinds of questions that drive all of us, and we all fit into one of those categories. And I'm the how person. There's the why person, there's the what person, and there's the how person. Now, it doesn't mean it's exclusively that, but that's the question that we end up spending most of our time on. And for me, while I like exploring the what, because without that you don't really know which direction you're going. The why is getting inside the minds and the hearts of people, or in some cases of churches, in understanding what makes them tick. What are the variables in their life and their history and their story cause them to take the positions that they take, and be open to the ideas they are open to, or resistant to those that they are not. But then once those first 2 have been defined and clarified, then the question is, how do you do? How do you get to where you want to be? How do you become what you need to become? The how part of the equation. And because of my connections, my own family life, and people that are dear to me, and I'm trying to understand how they got to where they are spiritually, and how, if there is a role for me in the relationship and in the conversations, what is that role? What is it I need to do? What it is that I need to say? What is it I need to understand, so that I'm not assuming anything, I'm not projecting anything on them that is not true? You know, I've learned over the years in pastoral ministry, you can read all the books on a particular faith system, religious group, denomination. And you can have all the historical data, the documentation about what's happened and why and who and where. But then when you talk to people who are actually involved in that, most of them are not even aware of those details. There's something less tangible for them and why they are where they are. And unless something happens to change in their lives where they start asking the question, is this really working for me? Nothing's going to change. They're not going to explore. They're not going to look. They're going to be pretty well satisfied and contented. And so just a little backdrop for those of you who have, lived at least 40 years, that Christianity in America, the American culture, which was influenced by Judeo-Christian thinking, writing, was prevalent across the board until 1990. And in 1990, there's a lot of things that globally changed, but one of the things that changed was the mindset generationally. When we went from the builder generation to the boomer generation to the buster generation and on down to whatever the generation is now, there's been a trending away from this system of absolutes that were at the heart of our Constitution, our laws, our history, and our faith systems. That because there is a God who is a moral God, then he establishes those things which are good and those things which are evil, those things that are right and those things which are wrong. And those were generally acknowledged. Even if we didn't agree on what those things were, there was an understanding that there was a clear divide. There was a separation, that good existed, evil existed. And how you believed and how you acted was a reflection of the acknowledgement of those absolute things. In 1990, because of the changes in our culture, a drifting away from its foundations, that people began to question, younger adults began to question, the concept of absolute rights and wrong. And so culturally, relativism is what crept in. And so it's all about who you are, where you are, when you are, as to whether something is actually right or wrong, good or evil. And so those were constantly moving targets. And once you assume that position of no absolute right and wrongs, then it brings into question the belief systems that have been the foundation of your culture and your society. Evangelical Christianity has been built on the content, the evidence, the trustworthiness of the Bible, and the things that are outlined there as good and evil, good and bad, within certain parameters. And those were acknowledged and accepted. Even if they weren't actually applied and lived by, there was at least that acknowledgement. So when people backed up and said, well, truth and morality they're not really absolute, they're relative, then it brings into question the very foundations upon which those positions were based before. And so the trend was forward from 1990 until now. There has become a more, I want to say, insidious philosophy or thinking process that has been a part of the undermining and the moving away from faith. Those of you who have followed with me for any length of time realize that I had mentioned a book that was written by a friend of mine who's a pastoral counselor, a clinical psychologist in Maryland, and I even showed this to you. Overhearing a Christian apology to the nones, the N-O-N-E-S. And while that's primarily a generational shift, that in the recent survey work that has been done, the census taking that has been done about people and their faith systems, that in the 1950s, 80% of the American population claimed to be associated, affiliated, connected with some sort of entity or belief system. And so those of us that were born in the middle of the last century, that was the world and the climate that we grew up in. Those numbers have been trending down since then, so that now there is a remarkably high percentage of people who, out of all the options of faith systems or belief that they hold, would pick the category of none of the above. And so therefore they're being referred to as the nones. They don't subscribe to any of those. And so in my dealing with people who hold those positions, they would describe themselves as nones, and some of them will be so so bold and so courageous as to, admit really where they are. From those who would say, well, I was raised to believe this, and I used to think this, and I used to believe this, but now I've moved away, and I'm not really sure. I'm relatively certain that there is a God, but then the question is, which God is that? And is it even possible to know that God? And how do you know that God? Or how do you know about that God? And so they fall in the category of the agnostic, simply meaning those that do not know. They're uncertain, they're unsure. And so among the nones, there would be a remarkably high percentage of people that fall into that category. Many of them grew up in Methodist churches and Baptist churches and Catholic churches and other kind of churches. And early on, they would have embraced one of those positions, say that's a reflection of who I am and what I believe. But as they became adults and really growing into a culture and a society that no longer values those positions, then they finally had the freedom to be honest with themselves and with those that are doing the survey work. And then there are others who are unabashed, who just simply say, I'm not an agnostic, I'm truly an atheist, that there is no God. Now, interestingly enough, I'm shooting this on the day after, sorry folks from Maryland, the Texas Rangers eliminated the Baltimore Orioles from the Major League Baseball playoffs. And so while I was watching, the last of those innings, I was actually listening to a podcast between a podcaster who's a believer, had a very popular program from some 17 years now. He's moving into writing, being interviewed by what is known as one of the New Atheists. And the New Atheist is a very young guy. He's got a huge following online. And so they had this discourse about what both of them see has been taking place. And interestingly enough, the New Atheist was very concise in his disbelief system. And he even distinguished between those that don't believe in God and those that believe there is no God. Because he said to say that somebody believes there is no God is to profess a faith system, a belief in something that doesn't exist. For somebody to say to not believe in God simply means that they have no faith system. And now, on most of you, that's a hair-splitting nuance that you don't really get the subtle differences because they end up at the same place. And so you have those people categorically. And while, I'm always interested in those encounters, as a matter of fact, in the gym, I guess it was 3 weeks ago, I was in there on a day when it wasn't particularly busy, and I have my routines. I go in there and I do my stuff. I don't sit on a piece of equipment and do my Facebook stuff. I'm in there to get the pain over with and go do something actually more pleasant. And so I'm in there and I'm on one of those pieces of multiple use equipment. They've got 4 sides and they've got 4 different things you can do on those. And so I was doing some my bicep and my tricep exercises, and there was a lady on one side of the piece of equipment who was there, and she was close to my age. Matter of fact, I think she was 65. And she was watching me, and when she finished on one side of the equipment and then she moved to the other side of the equipment, she made some comment about that stack of weights on the cable part that I was using and how big that was. And of course, it didn't hurt my feelings at all that she saw that and acknowledged that. And she said, I can't do nearly that much. And so I paused to acknowledge her and to engage in conversation. I said, well, it's basically testosterone that women don't have as much as men do, and that's the reason you can't look like a man, bulk up, physically. And it's simply the differences between our gender and our hormonal chemistry. And so we began to talk about, being in the gym. She said she'd been doing this for 45 years. And at age 65, she was remarkably fit. And so anyway, just continuing conversation, and I'm always curious in those moments about what God is doing and what my opportunity might be. And she made some passing comment about men and what some comic said about men, and his line for them was that, she said, they said there's three things that will make a man happy. One is sports, one is food, and the other is sex. And so in that moment, I felt it appropriate for me to go to sort of let her in on who I was and where I was coming from. I said, well, I'm a preacher, and I tell the clean version of all those things, and those things are listed as football, food, and fooling around. And she laughed about that, and then she said, well, we couldn't be further apart. And I went, how's that? She said, you said you're a preacher, and she said, I'm an atheist. And I said, I don't have a problem with that. I said, I've got a brother that's an atheist. I know atheists. And so we began to continue to talk, and I gave her probably 20 minutes of time that I didn't necessarily had an appointment waiting, but anyway, to me it was worth the investment in her. And she made the observation that she owned a farm, and she had a man to come out and shoe a horse of hers. And in the midst of finish up on one shoe, she admitted that she was an atheist. She said, without saying a word, he gathered up all his stuff and left, did not finish the job. He was so offended by the fact that I didn't believe in God. And I was like, well, I'm sorry that happens. I know that happens. But anyway, I said, we need to talk. We can talk some more, so I look forward to seeing you. And her name is Donna, so if you want to pray for an atheist, pray for Donna, that I'll have a chance to have a conversation with her. But anyway, it's exploring those extremes from, on one end, you have those who pronounce themselves as atheists, and on the other end, and this is the more troubling one, is those who previously had claimed to be born-again Christians, evangelicals, sold out to the truth of the Gospels and who Jesus was and who had actually joined with atheists on the other end because they no longer believe. And so in my question is, how does that happen? So I'm going to read a brief scripture to you today, sort of as backdrop before we completely run out of time. And in my trying to understand so that I can be a more effective communicator of the gospel and a more effective witness in the people that I engage, encounter, I want to be well informed so that I can talk with them, I can converse with them, that they do not take my participation as a talking down, as a condescension, as a judgment, but more as a hearing, a listening to them and what it is that they have to say. So this is taken out of Genesis 3, and really just the first couple of verses. Now the serpent was more cunning than any animal of the field which the Lord God had made. And he, the serpent, said to the woman, has God really said, you shall not eat from any tree of the garden? Now, you and I both know there's a whole lot more to the story than that, but that's really all that's necessary. The serpent is introduced in chapter 3 without any introduction. You have the creation account in the first two chapters, the creation of both man and woman, the place that God puts them, the responsibility He gave to them, and then you turn the page to chapter 3 and we're introduced to the serpent, who has this conversation with Eve. And really, you only have to have the first part of the question to really understand the nature of the question that is driving this current environment of people that are deconverting. That's what they're calling it. They had converted once, and now they have deconverted. And it's taken on an identity. It's known philosophically or in religious circles as deconstruction. They had a faith that was constructed on revelation and a belief system. And now that's been deconstructed. And in my mind, my question has been, how does that happen? I know for myself that when I was convinced that God was speaking to me as a 6-year-old child, that was an invitation into a faith relationship with Him that I said yes to. I confessed my faith in Jesus, and in hindsight, I may have shared this recently, that in that moment, sitting there in that church service, that really all that I think I heard, not with these ears, but with the ears of my heart, where God just spoke my name. And there was something in that moment and in that interaction when I knew who He was and I knew what He was asking. And so I went forward and I made public my faith commitment. And for me, there's been no looking back. I understand over time, back when I was an adolescent, it was a very common thing for the kids who had grown up in my world and in similar kind of churches that had made commitments and been baptized at a young age to encounter a period of doubt and uncertainty. Not really sure whether it was true or not. Some of them never resolved it and they wandered away. Some of them struggled for a lot of years, and so it was an unestablished, it was a non-foundational component of their lives that they thought it might be true, they were hoping it was true, they were not certain it was true, but it ended up not being a driving force, a compelling force in how they conducted themselves. And so for the casual observer, they would look at them and wonder whether it was true or not. And then there are those who finally decided that, quote, the decision they made as a child was for the wrong reason. They were trying to accommodate somebody else in their life to please them, and it really wasn't real. But at this stage in their journey, they wanted to settle that issue. So they once again proclaimed their conviction, their faith in Jesus Christ and His death on the cross for their sins, and just picked up and went forward from there. And over the years in pastoring, more so 30 and 40 years ago than in the recent years, is I had those conversations with people that, when they got in the middle of life, 30, 40, 50 years of age, and I had that gospel conversation with them, and they expressed that uncertainty, the lack of assurance of that. I said, well, this is really easy. Just drive a stake in the ground now. Let's settle the issue. You may or may not have known what you were doing back then. It may or may not have been real, but just let's drive a stake in the ground and say, from this point forward, I declare this is true, and that's how I'm going to conduct myself. And so they moved on, and they stopped struggling with it. They had some resolution, and so moving forward for many of them, then they began living like it was really true. So in this whole process of understanding, I've been reading a good deal about this whole business of deconstruction. Because I want to understand, and I see this as accounting for why so many churches are actually dying. That is, as the older generations are disappearing, going to the grave and to their reward or their punishment, the new generations coming along that don't subscribe to all of those practices, no faith system. What is the common ground that I perceive is where the slippery slope begins? And you may be one of those that as a child or as an adolescent, you responded to a gospel invitation, vacation Bible school, a church service, a camp, or it could have been a one-on-one conversation, and you said yes, and so you embraced that, but somewhere along the way, you stepped on a slippery slope, and it led you away from those core values. You began to question those and doubt those. And you may have ended up at a place where you say, well, then, patently it's not true. And I'm convinced that there are things that explain basically all of human conduct. I know the famous, psychologists of the past, the Freuds, and others. It was based on observing human nature that they came to the conclusion that there are things that explain why people behave the way they do, why they believe the way they do. And so I come at from the faith side of things, asking the same kind of questions. And when you get to the heart of it, in listening to the testimonies of people who have deconverted or deconstructed, the question that was posed by the serpent to Eve in the garden invariably is where it always starts. When someone, in whatever the context happens to be, whatever the life experience, the life moment happens to be, they've believed it up until now that God said it, but now they really start to second guess themselves and even second guess Him. And the question becomes, did God really say? And for those of us that don't understand that, we understand the question. And those of us that are studying this, we understand the variables that are contributing to people asking those questions. Has God really said? Now, I'm not going to be able to answer all these things, and I know there are many that will dispute my position. But in this whole journey, let me sort of explain this to you, because this is what God is doing in my life as a part of answering this question. Because I want to be that person who recognizes a person's absolute right to say, I no longer believe in God. They have that absolute right. I want to grant them respect in their personhood, to say that they have a mind, they have a capacity for reason and logic, and whether it's faulty or not, they have the right to end up where they've ended up. But if I, as a Christ follower, and by the providence of God have been put into an encounter with them, and we get to engage in this kind of conversation, I want to be able to respond to them in a meaningful way that really goes back and examines those questions and the context of those questions. And in the hopes that I might be used of God to cause them to stop and go, well, you know what? I never really thought of that before. And on second thought, and who knows, I don't take any credit for it. I'm not the Holy Spirit. I can't do the work in their heart, but I can be an instrument that God uses in those conversations to help people come back to faith. Now, you need to know, I happen to believe that when somebody has had a genuine conversion experience, I don't think you can lose that. I don't believe in falling from grace. I believe in falling away from grace, and I think that's what happened, but I don't believe in falling from grace. But I don't know whether somebody has really had that experience or not. And for those that are quick to say yes or no and then simply move on, that's on them and not on me. And so in this journey, I realize as a part of my calling to help churches figure out how to turn the corner and turn things around and move back in the right direction, I think it's imperative that churches understand this in their cultural context. That the reason that the young adults are leaving or the kids are leaving, or those that graduate from high school leave and don't come back, is because they have not been equipped and prepared to deal with the question that comes up, did God really say? And so a part of what I'm doing these days is I'm trying to engage to create opportunities for equipping the saints. This is what discipling really is about. It's equipping the saints to be prepared to deal with the contingencies of life when the challenge they're faced are not as simplistic as the questions and answers were made for them in Sunday school or church. Simply citing Scripture does not satisfy the questions that they have. And so I want to be an informed dialoguer with them to perhaps be used to bring them back to faith. And it seems that God is, He continues to make a way for me. And while I get to preach when I get to preach, and I'm grateful for that, it doesn't come often enough. I can continue to build bridges of relationships, meeting pastors and taking them to lunch and having conversations, and them, learning about me because I'm not from here, and hearing my story. And at some point, maybe God would encourage them to let me step into their life and share that journey. But because of my connection with the local Charleston Southern University, which is a Baptist college, Baptist university, not in name, but in principle and practices. And I have a growing circle of friends there that are on the faculty and the staff, and I celebrate that. It's just a lot of fun. This is not the world that I spent almost 30 years in Maryland. I wouldn't take for that, and a lot of that has prepared me for even this environment, to be able to speak to issues that perhaps others have not been able to speak to. And so as I've been reading, and I watch a lot of YouTube and trying to understand the deconstructing mind and conversations and debate and contest, that I became convinced that somebody, quote, somebody needs to do something about this. And I know that I don't have a platform. I don't have standing. I don't have the resources. But by the providence of God, He has brought me into a relationship with people who have all of the above. And so last week, while I was on the campus and had lunch with an Old Testament professor who's a friend, to hear his story. He was raised as a Catholic and became an atheist, and then he had a journey to faith, and God led him to get a PhD, and now teaches Old Testament at this college. and to hear his story, which was a lot of fun, and to talk to him about these issues and what could be done about this. And he said, well, you need to talk to the dean. Well, the dean, Dean Phillips, is another one of my friends, and so I popped into his office and we talked about this issue. And I said, there needs to be some forum, there needs to be somebody to do something that at least raises the bar of information and awareness of this problem so that people are equipped to answer the question, did God really say? And so in our conversation, I asked him, I said, well, did you, how much do you know about Bart Ehrman? Now, Bart Ehrman, if you want to look him up, he'll be all over the internet, all over YouTube. He was a New Testament scholar who deconstructed. And now his whole mission in life is to help others deconstruct. He is, in effect, an atheist now, whose sole mission in life is to destroy the faith of others. I'm referring to him in my circle of friends as the apostle of the apostate, those who walk away from faith. Now, my own assessment is for those who have had a genuine conversion experience and deconstruct, I think most of them simply move on, put it behind, and don't do anything. I believe for the person who makes it their mission to destroy the faith of others, I doubt seriously that they had a genuine conversion experience. I think they went through the ropes. I think they answered all the right questions, checked all the right box, said yes to all the right people, and got an education in that field and thought it was true when nothing had ever really happened. And so for them, their deconstruction was embracing what had been true all along, just sort of hidden from them. And so he said, hey, yeah, I know about him. And so he picked up a book. It was a paperback version of this one right here called Dethroning Jesus. Exposing popular culture's quest to unseat the biblical Christ. And he opened up, he said, okay, here's Bart's story, and he went through that. And so anyway, we began to explore that. He said, it would be really good. He said, we have 3 Baptist colleges in South Carolina, and he said, we really don't cooperate on anything. He said, I think it'd be cool if we could host an event in Columbia, the state capital, where we could promote this and we could bring people from all these schools into a common venue there where we could have a panel discussion. We've had people teaching those issues. So he said, that's great. I think that's something we ought to do. I went, okay, well, let's explore that. And so it just so happened, my favorite expression for God's sovereignty is that the next morning, the man who is the sort of the chief officer in the South Carolina Baptist State Convention, Tony Wolf, go figure, he's a friend of mine. He just started a job here 6 months ago. I engaged him before he ever showed up. I got to speak with him when he showed up, and now we have a relationship. And so while we were both on the road to a shared event, then I put this out and I said, how much do you know about this? And he knew a ton about this. And he said, well, I've written about this. And he said, now, what we'd love to do is we would love to partner with somebody else, provide the resources for this to be able to happen. I went, that works for me. So let's proceed from there. And so we get to the event, and I see him, and I see a bunch of others that are there, friends that I know, and because there was a lunch event associated with it, I sat down at one of the round tables, a table for 8, but there are only 2 of us sitting at it. And I had friends sitting in front of me and friends sitting behind him, but the guy sitting at my table was somebody I didn't know. He was a young guy. And so because we were sitting there listening to people on the platform speaking and doing the kind of thing, there was no chance to really engage. But as we were wrapping that part down, then we turned to each other and made the introductions. Well, he is on the faculty of North Greenville University, which is one of the other Baptist universities. And so I asked him, I said, so what do you know about deconstructionism? He said, are you talking about postmodern deconstruction? You're talking about deconversion? That told me that he knew. And so I explained to him what I was thinking about, doing. He says, let's make this thing happen. So we exchanged information, and I said, I'll put you in contact with the dean of the local college, and let's see where all this goes. So anyway, I came back and I ordered this book. I have yet to read it. And in the process, I had been reading, at the recommendation of my younger brother, this book called R.C. Sproul's If There Is a God, Why Are There Atheists? Now, Sproul is one of, our favorite writers, and the book is, I would say it's, 90% great. There was one chapter in there that was a little deep, and for me, but by and large, it was a very, very, very good read, and I can recommend it. So I wrapped that up. And then while watching stuff on YouTube and reading and listening to interviews, I actually watched a group of Christian celebrities in a panel discussion being interviewed. They'd all been raised in Christian homes. They became musicians. They became famous as Christian musicians and went on the road and toured for a number of years. And the three of them, two men and a woman, all of them went through deconstruction and walked away from their faith. And through the providence of God, they were turned and brought back into a living relationship with Christ. And so they were talking about that journey and the things that contributed to that journey and addressing this question, which was the original question that has not changed. Has God said? And they spoke very well, to this issue. And if you read and you listen to Bart Ehrman, who's one of the several that does this, that really is the only question, because he says God didn't say anything. The Bible is not reliable. The Gospels are full of contradictions. The New Testament apostles did not write the Gospels. They could not have written the Gospels. There are contradictions through it. It's unreliable, and so therefore it is not true. And the sooner you embrace that, and essentially he comes across as, if you're as smart as I am, you'll believe what I believe. I don't know whether you know this or not, but arrogance, it really doesn't play well with me. Spiritual arrogance especially. And in the midst of this, and it was something that Dr. Ben Phillips said to me in his office that day, he said, well, have you seen what happened with Andy Stanley? And it's like, well, no, because I don't follow Andy Stanley. I've never followed Andy Stanley. When he broke away from his dad and took that property that First Baptist Church Atlanta had bought for another campus, that became his property, started with like 2,500 people to do his own thing, and eventually broke away from the denomination to do his own thing and became rich and famous, a mega church pastor. Huge following, people hanging on every word. And he wrote a book probably 20 years ago. And essentially in that book, he said, if you do what I do, you can have what I have. And that means you can be as successful and famous as I am. I was done with Andy at that point. So I've not listened to anything. That spiritual arrogance was a turnoff for me. So what has happened recently in the last 2 weeks, he had a conference at his church in which his public statement is he no longer believes that homosexuality is a sin. He said, we're not into drawing lines, we're into drawing big circles. So Andy Stanley has gone woke as well. And the reason he can go from where he has been to that place is because he's asked this same question, has God really said? And the answer is, in his mind, the answer is no. Oh, okay, so in the meantime, I haven't read this one. This one came in too. This was called Coming to Faith Through Dawkins. Richard Dawkins was not a deconvert. I'm pretty sure that he was exposed to some variety of Christianity as an Englishman, probably the Church of England. But he's been a lifelong atheist, and he's been one of those militant atheists, very critical, condescending, and judging of any people of faith. Wrote The God Delusion, made him famous, made him rich, and he's been in a number of debates with people, and so he's accounted for helping people deconvert. Because he'd say, God didn't say because there is no God, so therefore God couldn't say, so it's just all rubbish. Get on with your life, believe what you believe. And you can do well without that. And so I stumbled onto this fact that a person that was on his staff and worked for him for a number of years left his employment and became a born-again Christian. And so he wrote this book because he began to examine his own journey, his own questions about faith, and he began encountering other people that are highly educated, many of them scientists, who embraced Dawkins' atheism, but then deconstructed Dawkins. Isn't that funny? Deconstructed Dawkins and came to faith in Jesus Christ. One of the stories in there, I've not read it yet, but I was familiar with it because I saw his testimony of his coming to faith. So I'm looking forward. So I share all this to say, because my time is running out here, is that this is where I am, and this is where I hope you can be. That the people that you will encounter wherever they happen to be is many of them will say, yes, I believe those things are true in the Scripture, but they don't have a clue what Scripture says. They were taught to believe it. They'd put their hand on it and swear on it in court, even though you don't do that anymore. And they say, I believe it's true, but they don't even know what it says. And so they're not really in a position to talk to other people. They have a simple faith, and God bless them. God said it, I believe it, even though I don't know what he said, that settles it for me. And so that's how they've lived, that's how they will die. And that's who they are. For those of us who feel a responsibility to be the best that we can be at demonstrating the validity of the Gospels, is we need to have a grace about us in listening to people who are struggling in their faith, and understanding that this is the question that we will help them through. Has God really said? Demonstrating grace to them, demonstrating love to them, giving them time to listen patiently, to try to answer their questions, to not be judgmental, and then to live out a faith before them that says it does make a difference in who you are and how you live and what you do. So that's where I am in this whole process. And I would encourage you to do some reading. Watch some YouTube. That's easy enough to do even if you don't like to read. And arm yourself, because you are surrounded by people, many of who have a faith relationship and have been led away into deception. Many who have never had a faith relationship and have been led away to that which was truly their position all along. But we're called to be salt and light in redeeming grace to the people that we've given an opportunity to have an encounter with. Pray for me as I continue to try to find what my role is, if it's connecting the dots for other people, so that we can put on an event that people can come attend and get the answers to the questions they're struggling with, because there are reasonable answers to their questions. Thank you for those of you who support our ministry. I do want to hear from you. There's more going on than I can really articulate now of what God is doing and what he may be doing and what I may get a chance to do. And so I thank you for your words of encouragement, your responses to our videos. And for those of you who support our ministry financially, I'm grateful, because it allows us to do much of what we're doing and continuing to span our connections and our relationships and our opportunities to do kingdom work. And so if you'd like to be among those, there are ways to do that electronically, or if you're old school and you just want to drop a check in the mail, make it out to Church Rebirth Ministries Incorporated. We're a 501c3, so this is a tax-deductible contribution, and mail it to this address, and trust me, it will be received with gratitude and put into the Lord's service here as best we know how. Thank you for your grace, for your attention, and most of all for your prayers for us, and look forward to each time we have to spend with you.